You need to use this one? I'll throw that one back and leave these out for questions. Okay.
All right, good evening. Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, the microphone is working. Maybe I need to move it up. Is that a little bit better? Okay. Thank you all for coming to the Angular Mountain View meetup. My name is Stephen Fluin. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team. So normally we do a bunch of announcements about Angular, but instead of that, the entire talk and the entire session tonight is all about what's new. So I'm not going to do a abbreviated update section. I'm going to really try and go into where we've come over the last few months, and then we'll get into some other things. I think this is going to be a little bit of a fun night. A lot of people, I think, have brought laptops intentionally because we're going to have a little bit of a workshop section later where I really want to encourage everyone to share and collaborate and help each other in a way that we don't necessarily always do in our normal meetups where it's more of just content delivery. So hopefully you can get to know your neighbors, you can advance your projects a little bit, and we can all come together a little bit as a community. So there's going to be kind of two parts to the evening. So first, we'll do a set of technology updates. So I'm going to go through a lot of stuff that's happened in Angular, as well as a little bit about where we're headed in the future. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along because there's a lot of things that are going on necessarily behind the scenes. But what's new is something that's different to every single person here because some of you pay attention to every commit. Some of you sit and live in our Reddit channels. Others don't necessarily pay as much attention, and all of this stuff is going to be new, and you might have some questions that we haven't answered here. So as I'm going along, feel free to stop me at any point. And then what we'll do is we'll move into a bit of an update workshop, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm going to be talking a lot about versions tonight, but I want to remind everyone it's just Angular. So when we talk about versions 4, version 5, et cetera, the goal is not to include that as the name. So I'm gonna, no offense. I hope not to see books that say Angular 4 or Angular 5, et cetera. I think one of the things that we showed off between versions 2 and versions 4 were that these things are very, very similar. And what operates in 2 just fine is probably going to keep working in 4, and it's probably going to keep working in 5, and so on, right? Because we are trying to balance the rate of innovation with a high level of stability that makes you as developers more productive. If you have to go and relearn everything every 6 months, you are not going to be successful with Angular, and that's not our goal, right? We want to make sure that this is a framework and a platform that developers can get to know, they can become experts at, achieve a level of mastery, and then we can continue to expand and evolve the framework to do even cooler, newer things. So it's just Angular, despite tonight we're going to have a lot of version numbers kind of throwing at you. I want to go a little bit back to March of 2017. So this was the day we released version 4. So if you remember, even before that, with version 2.0.0, we actually had a Mountain View meetup. It was at a different place. We had balloons drop. But with version 4, we did it a little bit differently. Instead of having balloons drop, because it was this big kind of overwhelming moment, we did something a little bit more relaxed. And so I actually took a video of the release of version 4. And I need permission to view this video. Okay, let's fix this. So in a second, I'm going to show a video of what it looked like to release version 4. But it was actually a relatively relaxed affair. We were at our desks. Not most people had actually gone home for the day. And Victor Berchet was actually sitting at his terminal trying to monkey with the npm commands that actually push a set of source code up to the server. Open sharing settings. Share. All right. let's try that again. This is going to be super overwhelming at this point. It was not worth this much buildup. So here's Victor Berchet, about to hit the npm command that releases version 4. Oh, we don't have audio. Hold on. Audio test. All right, we don't have audio, so you're just going to have to bear with me and look at his funny face. So we did it in slow motion, and then he accidentally hit the, we actually had to film it about 4 or 5 times because npm is really hard. He hit the wrong command sometimes, but it all turned out okay, right? We got version 4 out. It was not a big deal. Developers adopted it. They were able to use the latest version. It didn't fundamentally change any of the concepts you knew. And this is something we definitely wanted to continue and really kind of live as we continue to evolve the framework. All right, so now it is September 2017, and we're nearing another one of these very, very minor or major milestones, major milestones in the platform. And so one of the things that I really want to note is that Angular is getting very, very popular. So we track a number of different metrics and statistics kind of across the web in terms of who uses Angular, what sites are adopting it. We've been seeing this for a while now, but we've actually seen a bit of a hockey stick. So the number of daily sites launching in production, something like doubled over the last 4 or 5 months. And so we're very, very happy with the kind of huge breadth of adoption of Angular across a lot of very big companies, as well as a lot of very small companies. So let's dig into kind of what's happened since that March release from a technology standpoint. And as we're going here, I'm going to do a little bit of technical demos to try and show off how you can take advantage of some of these features. So the first one I want to talk about is animations. So we added a lot. We had animations in Angular from 2.0. We added a bunch more in 4. But then since 4, we've actually added some things that make it really powerful in ways that it wasn't before. So this is things like you can do route change animations. So as I'm navigating from one part of my application to another, I can animate that. And this is really built on a series of new APIs that exist that are very fantastic. And let's actually give Matthias, who does all of the animations work in Angular, a big round of applause for these, because they're pretty cool. In particular, I've picked out 2 of my favorite. So the first is query, which historically, when you did an animation, you would apply an animation to a single element within your application. So at the component level, at the DOM node level. So as state transitions happen within your application, you could change that element. But what you couldn't do was figure out, hey, I want to do things to subsets of that element. And so this is really the thing that enabled us to do route change animations, is being able to say, hey, when the routes change, I want to do things to all of the subsets of that, all the pieces of those routes, and have them render onto the screen, off the screen, and so on. You can also say, hey, I want to take, when I do this kind of general animation or the state transition, here's what I want to do to each of the subcomponents that exist within that element. You can also do things like staggering now. So instead of all of your animations having to happen at the same time, we can do this very nice stagger, which is based on the number of elements, right? So I can set up, hey, let's do a 50 millisecond stagger, a 100 millisecond stagger. And I'll give a couple of demos of this. And then the last piece that is really my favorite is that we now have an animation builder. So where I can now specify what transitions I want to happen as part of an animation. I can define them more generically, and then we can reuse that animation in multiple parts of our application in a parameterized way. So I can say, hey, in this place, I'm going to parameterize this animation in this way. In this other place, I'm going to parameterize it another way. But then I'm still doing the same animation based on those contexts. And so what I wanted to do is again, my favorite thing, which is route animations. And I wanted to show you relatively quickly how fast you can get up in speed with this idea of when I move from route A to route B, let's visually demonstrate that to users and supply additional context about what's happening in the application that gives users a more intuitive understanding and connection to what you're trying to achieve. So let's jump over to VS Code here. What I've got up here should be, oops, I'm going to reopen it. what should be here a relatively blank CLI project. So this is the what's new Angular project. And so I'm going to go ahead and run ng-serve here, and we'll take a look at what we've got. All right, so as soon as ng-serve finishes, we've got a basic CLI application. So basically before this demo, I ran ng-new, and then it looks like I also generated, oh no, there it is. So we've got an app component, we've got an app module. Everyone that's written an Angular application should have seen this before. And so now very quickly what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to create two routes in the application, a home screen and an about screen. And then I'm going to add animations in a way that you could do to any existing application out in the world today. So I'm going to go ahead and under the hood here, I'm going to use the CLI. So I'm going to use the ng-generate command to create two new components, a home component and an about component. I'm just going to use the short form here, so ng-gc, and I'm going to say home. So it's going to create all those files, and then I'm going to say about. It's going to create all the files for the about component, and it's also going to add those to the module, so doing all the declarations necessary. And then I'm going to go ahead and jump into my app module, and I'm going to add the routing module. And then I'm going to import the router module, and I'm going to give it a configuration. This configuration should just be an array of routes. And so we've just got two routes in our application. If I could get rid of my extra brackets here. Oh, if you see me make a mistake, you get a sticker. So there's that for everybody. You can also have a sticker if you don't see me make a mistake. Or I get a sticker maybe. All right, so we've got a home component that's at the empty path. And then we're going to say path about. And that's going to go to the about component. And then I'm going to add the router outlet to my HTML. So pull up the HTML, router outlet. All right, hopefully, is there anyone that this does not look familiar to? Good. And then if we look at our application, home works because by default we're navigating to the home. And then let's create a couple links here. So we're going to make a div. We're going to say a router link equals /. We'll just have that go home. And then we'll make an about link so that we can navigate our app. So hopefully if we go home, it goes home. We go about, it goes out, about. So now we have these two routes in our application, just like you might have in your app. And now I'm going to follow a set of steps that adds the necessary pieces in order to make these routes animatable. So what's actually happening under the hood is relatively important. So the routes that we load as part of your application don't get loaded into the router outlet. They actually get loaded as siblings of the router outlet. And that's a really important concept. And the reason we do that is because if we wanted to animate these things, we actually need them both to exist at the same time. And if we did each one inside of the router outlet, then you have this weird conflict of they both exist, where do we put them, which one has precedence, things like that. So because they're both siblings of the router outlet, this is a much simpler process. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a container for the router outlet so that we can apply a couple styles to any of the components that are getting loaded. So I'm going to create a class called route container here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and style these so that the position of the route container is relative, so that if we're moving things around, if we're moving the children around at all, we can do that by the bottom top properties, the position absolute. And then I'm also going to make them display blocks so that they're displaying appropriately. So I'll just throw these two things into our style sheet here. So normally that doesn't do anything, right? Because it should render exactly the same. But now what we can do is we can start to think about animating those things at the same time. So next we're going to go into our app module, and I'm going to include the browser animations component from @angular/platform browser/animations, I believe. Module. That's the fight where your modules are fighting. All right, then let's import that. All right, so the next up, I'm actually going to wire up an animation. So this is what's really neat about the query API. I am going to define the route animation on this container, and then I'm going to use the query to apply to the children, as we'll see in a little bit. So I'm going to copy code, not bore you guys. And so the important thing here is we're defining a animation. So this @ sign, if you haven't used animations, is what defines a new named animation. And we're just calling ours route animation. And then I'm actually going to be calling a method as part of that to say, what is the state? So whenever this method returns a different result, then we're going to get an animation between those two states. And so we're going to use get depth on the outlet. And then in order for my outlet to exist, I'm going to say my outlet equals outlet. All right, so that's enough on our template side in order to do pretty much everything we need in order for this animation to work. And now we're going to jump into our app component. So first, I'm going to pull in all of these really cool APIs. Actually, let's define the method first. So as I mentioned, we're using a method called getDepth in order to determine what the state of the application is. So I'm going to use this getDepth, and it's going to take in the outlet, and it's going to look at the activated route. So the route that the users currently hit, we're going to get data from that route. And so where does this actually come from? This comes from our route config up here. So what you can do is you can define a new property called data. So this is a standard Angular property. And then inside of that, or Angular router property, and then inside of that, I can define whatever data I want. So you could give your pages names, you could give them classes, whatever you want to do here. I like to do depths because I like this idea of a hierarchical app navigation, so that as I move from higher places in the app to lower places to more in-depth content, I'm always seeing the same visual transition. So we'll say home is depth 1, and then we'll say data depth 2 is for our about component. So now we actually have something that we can query as part of our app component. So our get depth is going to return that depth based on the route that's currently activated. And then I'm going to create the animation. So animations are done as part of the animations property on the decorator. So again, I'll just copy and paste this. This is all available online as well. But I'm going to walk you through. Oh, I didn't do my imports. All right, so let me walk you through just briefly what this is doing. Is this big enough for everybody? Okay. So if we look in the animations, it's an array. And in that array, we've got a trigger called route animation. So for every element that you are defining an animation on, you need one of these triggers, and then you use the name that you provided. Within that trigger, I'm actually defining 2 state transitions. So you can define as many state transitions as you want. So my state transitions are if I'm ascending in my hierarchy, so I'm going from, or excuse me, I guess descend, or going from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, I'm going to animate one way. And if I'm going the other direction, so from 3 to 2, 2 to 1, I'm going to navigate the other way. So you could, for example, if you had given all of your pages names, you could have said home to about. You could have said from payment to happiness. I don't know. Whatever sort of transitions you want to define, this is where you define the states and the from and the to position. And we have this nice comma syntax now that says you can actually define multiple transitions as part of a single animation. Then I'm going to say, hey, make the height of the box equal to the height that it's going to be at the end of the animation. So this is just if you have 2 pages that have different heights, I want to set it so that it doesn't collapse in the middle of the animation. Then I'm going to use the query API here in order to get the item that's entering. So if you remember, we have a router outlet, and then we have 2 siblings. One of them is entering, so one is just appeared on the scene, and one is leaving. So we can use these aliases enter and leave in order to access those and animate them. So for the item that's entering, I'm immediately going to transform it 100%. So I'm going to translate it off the page, basically. And then I'm going to position them all, both absolute, so that they take up the entire screen. And then at the same time, so this is what this group method does, I'm going to take the leaving element, and I'm going to translate it all the way off of the page with -100. And I'm going to take the entering element and translate it onto the page by taking it from the 100 that it was at before and putting it to 0. And then I'm defining a curve that tries to make this a little bit more natural than just a linear motion. And then we have basically the exact opposite here for the other direction. So I'm taking the entering item and I'm moving it all the way off to the left. And then as I'm bringing it on, I'm moving both those items to the right. So if I've done everything right, and just by this copy-pasted code and these Cannot find style. That one's new. App component. Line 19. All right, let's just kill this and restart it. Sometimes with the CLI, when you don't restart after you add additional dependencies to your module, it doesn't rebuild those additional dependencies, those additional imports. All right, so it looks like it did work this time. So let's see if this actually worked. So we're on the about, and so when we go left, we're kind of going up in the hierarchy of the application. So this is not working. We probably have an error here. Please include browser animations module. I thought I did that. TS, if you see anything wrong, please let me know. All right. All right, so when we're on the home screen, depth is 1. Oh, some rebuild problem, I think. All right, so this is exactly what we wanted. So now, as I navigate from route to route, based on the state transition that happened from lower depths to higher depths and vice versa, the application is moving around. So this is the combination of those query APIs, the group APIs, all these new APIs that are available in animations that allow us to make much more beautiful, engaging, interactive applications. And just to prove that it doesn't have to look as terrible as what I've written here, Matthias has built a bunch of very cool demos. So I'll just show off a couple of them. So this is a great example of the stagger. So as you're searching for someone, it's going to stagger out all the transitions and animations. So as we move between routes, as we change all these things, as we do searching, all of these things are in combination. So this is levels of animation that were not possible before in Angular, but now we've done what I believe is a really good job making them relatively intuitable as well as very declarative. So you see here, we slide open the panel and then we pull up the right thing. So this is all kind of very, very good UX, maybe a little bit slow just for demo purposes, but things that are now possible. All right, so that is one of the big things that's now available. Let's jump into the next thing that's now available. How many people here have started using the new HTTP client? Okay, a couple of you. How many people are aware of the new HTTP client? All right, so we have had HTTP as part of kind of the core of Angular since 2.0.0, but recently we actually shipped a new version of the HTTP client. We were actually relatively lucky when we were building this out because we found a way to make the new library first of all, not a breaking change that you have to deal with instantly, right? You have time to adapt to it. But the library itself is smaller. So we actually reduced the payload size to use HTTP calls and to use all these kind of mockable tools that we've had in Angular for a long time. We've made it easier to use, and we've made it more powerful and added features. So kind of the best of both worlds. Normally, you have to like give up one of these things, but fortunately, we were able to achieve all of them. So instead of http.get, and then where I normally have to map that to get the responses JSON out of the response, now we've made the API much simpler. For most use cases, for most developers, you're just going to run on http.get. And you can even do something very cool now. You can use TypeScript's generic features to actually tell TypeScript what sort of object you're going to be getting back from the API. So I can say http.get and supply a type. And what that does is the typing system will say, here's an object of that type. So let's go ahead and actually try this. So I'm going to first implement. Do you guys want to see me implement it the old way and then migrate? It's really straightforward. I could skip it or do it. Who wants to see it? OK, let's do it. All right, so I'm going to implement HTTP the way you would have in version 2, version 4, and so on. And we'll do this in the about component. So first thing I want to do, not in our test here, is I'm going to import the HTTP service from @angular/HTTP. And then I'm going to use that in the constructor. I'm going to say HTTP is an HTTP. And then I'm going to make a list and I'm going to populate this list by saying this.list equals http.get. And we'll use a path here, and then I'm going to say .map response turns into response.json. And so I happen to have a path here. I thought I had a path here. All right. So this is just a GitHub API that queries projects on the server. So I'll say const path equals this string. And so the specific string, we're doing a query for any repositories with the word Angular either in their name or their description. And map doesn't exist. So as part of RxJS, I have to do import RxJS, add operator map, so that we know how to do that. And then I'm going to take the response. I'm going to turn that into the response JSON. And then what I'm going to do in my HTML here for my home component is I'm going to say div ng4 equals let item of list pipe async. And if that exists, we're going to look at its items property, because the API actually returns an object with an items property, and that items property is an array that we can iterate over. And then what we'll do is we'll just say item.name, and we'll do a div. And then the last thing you actually have to do is you have to import it into your app module. So we'll go ahead and import HTTP module from @angular/HTTP. TypeScript doesn't like double quotes when you have full sensitivity turned on. That's perfectly valid JavaScript. All right, and let's see what I've broken this time. All right, so if we go back to the home route, home works, and then as soon as the route's loaded, we've made an HTTP call, we've downloaded the results, and now we're processing them, and we're stamping out a div for each and every one of those items. So you can make those beautiful, you can make them cards, you can make them whatever sort of presentation you wanted, but this is how we've retrieved the HTTP data. So that was the old way, using a library that I think was about 70 KB. It's very mockable. It's got a lot of cool tools in it. You can make post requests, you can pass extra bodies and things like that, but it's not as good as we could make it. And so in order to release a new version without forcing the update on you all at once, we've made a separate newer library that you can now adopt slowly over time with this kind of incremental update process. And so what I'm going to do now is instead of importing an HTTP module, I'm going to import the HTTP client module. And instead of being an Angular HTTP, it's going to be an Angular common HTTP. So just like before, I'm going to import that into my application. And then my TypeScript file is going to be very, very easy to update. So before we were importing the HTTP service, so we'll import the HTTP client service from @Angular common HTTP. And then I'll just say, make this an HTTP client. And I will just get rid of the rest of the source code here. So now it's just a very, very simple http.get, and the code still works the exact same. And then as to demonstrate that typing inference, or that typing help and support, I could actually say export interface get hub data. And I could say, oh, this has an items, which has an array of any's, right? I could supply as much typing information as I had about my API and my backend. And this is something that I'll talk about a little bit more when we get into schematics. But then from here, I can use the generics here and say that this http.get is going to give me back a GitHub data. And then if you hover over, you're going to see it's actually getting that type, and it's returning an observable of that type. So here I could actually say, I want a list of GitHub, an observable of GitHub data objects. And then we would just need observable. So you can see how the typing information that is very popular in Angular and helps you kind of throughout your development process, now we get typed data back from an HTTP. So it doesn't do validation, doesn't do normalization. You still have to trust your API. But as a front-end developer, this is still very helpful, because now I don't have to be guessing at the structure of that object or casting that. It can come back explicitly via the generic system. And we'll try this. This works about half the time when I'm demoing, just because of the demo gods. But theoretically, if we said in the home component, if we give it a little bit more data. So instead of maybe an any, maybe this has a name property, which was a string, and then like a ID, which is a number. We should actually, in our HTML, because of the Angular language services, in our ng4 here, up here, be able to see all of those options. So we know that ID and name are both properties of that item because of the type system, and then that's exposed in our HTML because of our semantic understanding of what's going on in these types and in your class. So that's a very powerful, very fantastic thing. Make sense? Any questions about HTTP client? Is anyone still afraid of HTTP client? Good. So there's one last thing to say about HTTP client, which is talking about new features. So one of the things that's been highly requested is the ability to modify all HTTP requests that go out from your application. So you might want to be always appending extra authentication data. You might want to be logging things. And so the way that we've implemented this is a new feature called Interceptors. And so an interceptor is a class that implements HTTP interceptor. And then what happens is this can be set up to run automatically as part of every HTTP client call that I make. So here is an example where I am implementing the intercept command. I'm getting the authorization header from an auth service. And then I'm going to clone the existing headers on the request. And then I'm going to pass it to the handler. And so what's nice is these can actually be combined. So I can actually say, hey, in this part of my application, maybe I have these 2 interceptors. In this other part of my application, I have these 3, which gives you a very natural way as you're scaling up to thousands of components or hundreds of services to say, do these things across all of my components, all of my HTTP calls. So this is a very powerful feature that's been requested for a very long time. Oh, we did the demo first. Hooray. One of the other projects that we've been working on is called Schematics. So how many people here are using the CLI today? There's people not using the CLI? We'll have to talk later because that's very interesting. So Schematics comes out of the CLI's team. In the past, we've talked about this idea that we want to move from a CLI model into more of an SDK model, where we will still have a CLI, but we're exposing all of the intelligence and all the wisdom that's baked into the CLI as an SDK, as APIs that you as a developer can integrate into whatever build process you want. So one of these tools that we had is called Schematics. So as of version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2 of the CLI, we were doing something called blueprinting, where we were taking a set of static files on disk, and then we were running basically regular expressions to swap out the different pieces. We're doing template interpolation in order to swap out the right variables in the right places. So we've now actually replaced the blueprint system, which we borrowed from Ember, and we replaced it entirely with what we call Schematics. And Schematics is a system that runs basically arbitrary code. So any code you want to run to do tree transforms. So in order to ng new a brand new project from scratch, we basically take in an empty tree, right, with no files, nothing in it, and we return a full Angular application. If we wanted to do a component, we're going to take in a tree, and we're going to look for the modules in that tree. We're going to add the component. We're going to add the folders and the files for that, and then we're going to modify the structure. And so the benefit of this over the blueprints that we had before is that you can put a lot more intelligence into these things. A really good example of that comes from the Drupal community. So we have a project going with them where Drupal is in a bit of, I'll say maybe an identity crisis, where a lot of developers want to take more control over the front end of their applications, but they still need the power of Drupal for doing content management. This is a very similar story to things like SharePoint and a lot of other backends. And so what you can do now, because we have the schematic system, is you can design a ng new command or an ng new component command or generate component command that actually queries an API. And the power of that is that by querying an API and then using the information from that API, you could, for example, automatically scaffold out services based on the shape of your backend. So I can either scaffold it out or I can update it. So I could just run ng generate my API. It queries some sort of backend, it looks up in a database, and then pulls out all those types, all that information, and creates services for me within Angular. So this is kind of a magical thing, and we think that people are going to be doing a lot of very cool things with this. But we started with the plumbing. We said, hey, we need a really good system for doing this, and we have that today, and it's in use by the CLI. There's also an associated command line tool. It's a little bit harder to use. I recommend you stick with the CLI whenever possible. Another project comes out of our Angular material team, So they are the ones that are responsible for taking the material design vision and implementing it as part of the Angular material project. So this is how do we make really great looking, accessible, usable components and make all of our applications look a little bit better. But as doing this, they've actually solved a lot of problems for accessibility and for usability that have nothing to do with material design. And so what they've done is they've started pulling out all of those common bits into what they call the CDK, or the component dev kit. And the power here is that they want to empower other component authors to take advantage of the work that they've done. So there's work that we've done for accessibility, bidirectional input. So some languages are right to left instead of left to right. There's some things that come into play when subparts of your application are scrollable. There's a lot of challenges around things like overlays. So with HTML, we're not actually, things aren't built very well for this concept of an overlay, because I want to define the overlay, the pop-up that's going to come up on my screen, as close as possible in the HTML to the item that's triggering it, right? Or into the context that is creating it. But in HTML, we have all these things like position absolute, overflow hidden, which mean that if I define an overlay at the same level as the thing that's creating it, it can end up getting bitten off, truncated in all sorts of terrible ways. And so they've designed a way to safely, in a way that's cross-browser compatible, as well as server-side rendering compatible, take that overlay, put it safely at a higher level in the tree so that it's always going to render appropriately. We've also started shipping kind of unstyled versions of a lot of our components. And so you first saw this with, I think, our data table. So this is the material design, Angular materials team's implementation of how do we display grid data, how do we make it sortable, pageable, filterable, how do we display arbitrary functionality within those cells. So they released both at the same time, a material design table and a data table, just a generic one. We are also doing this with Stepper, and you're going to see this with several other components. We also, today, did a this week sometime, are doing a 4.4 release. So this was a little bit unexpected. So the original plan was to go directly from 4.3 into 5. But what the team figured out was that there's actually a few features in 5 that we can backport that will make it easier to continue to migrate. And so two that I wanted to call out are compiler support. So there's a feature that probably only applies to maybe two of you in this room, which is that when you're doing exports within TypeScript and within Angular applications, you can only have one export. You can't say export as A and B, but we added that to the compiler because material design needs that. And so we've added that back into 4.4. But another really cool feature that we added back into 4.4 is something called whitespace removal. So for those of you who don't know, when we design our templates like this, so homeworks, div ng4, what ends up happening is this gets built by the compiler into a set of JavaScript code that says document.createElement or create node here, and then here's the change detection event, and when this change detection event runs, change the content of this DOM node. So all of this ends up becoming JavaScript. And the way that we do that today is in some ways a little bit naive, because for compatibility reasons, we actually take all of the white space that you coded there, and we say, you probably need this, and we turn that into JavaScript, where about 6% of people's JavaScript-generated code was white space from what we can tell. And so what we've done is we've added now an option that says, remove all the white space, I don't care. So in some components, you might care, and so we have an option to turn white space on and maintain that white space, but a lot of time we don't, we just want smaller bundles, and so that is now a feature that we've backported into 4.4. And so that's done via the Angular CLI's, or Angular compiler config in your tsconfig file. All right, are you guys ready for some V5 secrets? No? All right, we can skip it. All right. So developers often want to hear kind of all the secrets, like what's going into Angular next? We're an open source project. Everything we do is public. So at any time, if you're curious about something that the team is working on, you can see all of this on GitHub. But obviously, there's probably too much information there for most people to follow. I even have a hard time keeping up with all the cool things that the team is working on, all the things that the community is working on. And so what I've done is I pulled together just a brief summary of the things that are going to go into 5. But again, there's really no secrets here. All of these things you saw in earlier betas, you saw these in documents that were posted on our site. One of the highlights I'll say is we really, really believe in this idea that Angular needs to evolve very carefully and maintain a high level of stability. And so a lot of these things are improvements that aren't going to affect you. And so that may not sound exciting, to some of you, but this is kind of very exciting to us because this is what developers actually want. They want to stop thinking about Angular and start thinking about their code, right? I want to get back to work. My boss wants me to deliver these features by tomorrow. I don't want to have to deal with Angular having this level of churn. And so we're trying to continue to evolve Angular and keep it to the best of the web and offer new features and new capabilities, while at the same time not hurting developers. So let's dig in a little bit. So we are currently in the beta period for V5. And the headline for all of these changes really goes into 3 categories that we've set for the team: smaller, faster, easier to use. So how do we make the code size that we generate smaller? How do we make it bootstrap and run faster in the browser? And how do we make all these great features that we've released easier for developers to take advantage of? So the latest state is, as of today, we released beta 7, which has most of what is going to be in the final version of V5. So I'm going to break it down into each of these 3 categories. So in terms of smaller, this white space removal is actually a pretty big deal. So as I said, based on our tests, this removes about 6% of your generated code. So that's a 6% win that you get basically without doing anything. Hooray. We've also built something that we call a build optimizer, which I'll give a brief demo of later. And so this is a part of our CLI tooling where Webpack and Uglify are very good at tree shaking at the file level. So if you don't import from a file, they're not going to pull that into your project. And if you import but never use any of those symbols into your project, they're not going to include that into your project. But oftentimes, that means that we're including code that we're never using. And so one of the things we've done is we built a build optimizer that goes through your code and uses our understanding or semantic understanding of your application to mark things as, hey, they never actually used this. Let's mark it as what's called pure and let the tools remove those if they're not referenced. So this is actually a big deal. We've seen various reports. I'm curious to hear some of you tonight what you guys are seeing in terms of the effect of adding this tool to your build toolchain. But anything from something like 30 to 40% bundle size reduction again. So don't change any of your code. We made it smaller and faster. That's a big deal. We've also made some big changes in terms of the polyfills that we require. So in version 2 and version 4, we had an idea that we wanted to leverage the browser's IE18N features. So browsers actually have a lot of very cool capabilities for localizing things like currencies, dates, etc. And the nice thing about that is a lot of the locale data is sitting on the user's browser. After having this out for 2 versions or for a little bit more than a year, what we found is the browsers all implement them differently. And so we can't exactly trust that it's either in a browser, which was requiring polyfills for developers, or that it would actually work the same across multiple browsers. And so we've gone back a little bit to the way that we did things in AngularJS with a custom implementation of these IE18N pipes. And so we've removed the need to have the polyfills, and now we've actually made things smaller because you don't need those polyfills. We've also changed the way our injector works. And so again, this won't apply to most developers, but we've replaced our reflective injector with a static injector. And basically that means that we're doing more at build time, and so we're not needing to do reflection to see what the types of objects are and what the content of our objects are. So we don't need the reflect polyfills from ES 2015 if you want to be running on earlier browsers anymore. So faster. There's a project that most of us won't be affected by, but we've spent significant amount of time on. So as you know, we have a compiler in Angular. So we had historically 2 modes. We had JIT mode, or just-in-time mode, and we had ahead-of-time mode, where we would compile everything at build time before you ship that out to users. That was built as a kind of standalone process. But what we've done is, as of TypeScript 2.4, they've offered now a TypeScript transform pipeline. So as they're doing compilation, you can basically add additional pieces of work. And so we've rebuilt our entire compiler pipeline as part of this transform process. And so what this means, based on our testing, and this needs to be validated in the real world, is about 40% faster builds. So if you had a build that your production build took 1 minute and 40 seconds, it now takes like a minute instead. And so we've worked with a lot of companies like weather.com, et cetera, where they're building 30, 40 different production applications at the same time. And so a 40% reduction in the amount of time it takes to do a production build, that's a win for a lot of people. This also means your CI will run faster, a lot of improvements there. And then we're continuing to make the general framework smaller by removing things. So For example, we found that getters added a ton of extra code because of the ES5 support. So we've refactored a lot of our code not to use getters. So little things like this, we're really entering more of an optimization stage where it's not going to affect your day-to-day lives, except from the perspective that the code that you deliver to your users is going to be better and smaller and faster. The last piece is making things easier to use. So I talked about JIT and AOT. One of our longer-term goals is what we call AOT all the time. Because there's an event that happens sometimes with teams where they'll start building an application, they'll work on it for 6 months in Angular, and then they'll go to ship it in production. So they'll do their first prod build, which will turn on this compiler. And they'll realize, hey, oops, I did something in my decorators that's not allowed, right? Because we have to resolve those things at build time, not at runtime. And so we can't just execute arbitrary code in your decorators. And so now I'm in an oopsie situation where I have to go back and figure out how do I re-implement these pieces so that they're compatible with AOT. And we don't want that for developers. We want it to be intuitive, and we want you to see any error that you make in your code immediately as soon as you make it. And so there's a few things that we've launched for AOT to make it easier. One of these things we actually spoke about at an earlier Angular Mountain View meetup, which is a little project we called Edit NG. So I'll give a tiny demo of that for, how many people saw that presentation? Okay, interesting. So edit.ng, it's a little bit similar to Plunker. It's a little bit similar to browser stacks. There's a lot of really good web-based IDEs, and we are not trying to be the best one. The goal here is to take an Angular application and AOT it fully in the browser. So we're just ahead of time compiling. Basically, you've got a compiler here that I can run on my code, and then it will get out the right set of code. And then the other cool thing that we do here is we store all of the contents of the files up here as a gzipped string as part of the URL bar. So if I make edits here, in general, what would happen, it looks like we have a bug right now, maybe. In general, what will happen is we will update that gzip string. So if you send this URL to anyone, without any sort of server, without us seeing an inch of your code, you can share code and say, hey, I found this bug, or hey, here's a repro, or here's an idea that I had, which is a very cool concept. The next thing we've done is historically you had to do all of your testing in JIT mode just because of the way that we were bootstrapping dynamically. We've now made it possible to use your ng factory files in tests, so it's a lot easier. And we really do want to get to a point where we make ngc fast enough to use for development. And so we're going to see a lot of improvements in this speed because we want your ng serve, instead of using JIT, we want it to be in AOT by default, so that there's no two modes. You're always in AOT mode. Another feature from the Universal team, so for those of you who don't know, Universal is our project to do server-side rendering of Angular. So the idea is instead of shipping all of my code to the browser, which then runs client-side, I also want to run my Angular application on the server side, generate this fully rendered HTML that then is shipped down to the browser. This is really important for not really humans that are using this, but more machines. So if you have Facebook or Twitter that are scraping my site and generating a thumbnail, I want that thumbnail to be all the content that the user requested and the UX that the user requested. And so Universal was around, it was a community project as of 2.0. It's shipped as of 4.0. And as of 5.0, we're actually adding additional DOM support. So we have a new layer so that, for example, if you accessed a window global object, for example, we can now understand more of those out of the box and server-side render them. And what this means is that if you're using a library like jQuery or D3 for some piece of your application because you've got some dependency, we're now more able to server-side render those things without you doing any work, which is a really good thing. Yeah?
On C there, are you saying that it won't be then in the release of 5, that AOT will be on by default?
So, and this is why we're still in the beta and RC stage. Our criteria is if we can get it fast enough so that you don't notice switching from JIT to AOT, then yes, it'll be on by default. That might take longer than the 5.0 release. But the big nice thing here is that that's actually a CLI change, not a Angular change. And so we could release a new version of the CLI that turns that on by default. So we don't have to wait a full release cycle for that. And again, we're just waiting for it to be fast enough and good enough, and then we'll turn it on by default and no one will notice. And you guys will ask me, why did I come to that meetup? Nothing changed. We changed it and we didn't hurt you, which is our goal. ng upgrade lite. So one of the a lot of people don't know, we use ng upgrade extensively within Google. So as you guys know, Google has used AngularJS a ton, and now most of those teams are moving over to Angular. As part of that process, we have this ng upgrade tool set that lets you bootstrap both AngularJS and Angular at the same time. One of the problems with doing that is that things that happen in AngularJS land can trigger change detection in Angular land. And so the reason this is problematic is if you had an event or a listener in AngularJS that, for example, on mouse scroll, that was triggering some level of change detection in AngularJS, that's now triggering a complete tree change detection pass, which is fast in Angular, but it's still not fast enough to be running on every single mouse move event. And so what ng upgrade lite does is it gives you a further restricted version of ng upgrade that doesn't trigger extra change detection. So effectively what it does is it allows you to combine these two technologies without triggering change detection in one when you do something in the other. It comes with some additional limitations. So for example, you cannot use Angular services in your AngularJS code, and you can't use AngularJS components in your Angular code. But we'll have an article about ng upgrade lite. This has been around for, I think, a month or so now. It's in use at Google because every commit to master is in use at Google. So we'll have more information about that. And if you guys are interested in that, definitely let me know because we're looking to validate this with more and more use cases. I mentioned IETN pipes as being a reason that we're now smaller, but this is also a reason that we're now easier to use because what we found was that the IETN pipes or internationalization pipes didn't necessarily match the expectations users had. The APIs that the browsers implemented were not the easiest to use. And so by changing these pipes and taking more control of them, we've actually tried to make them simpler and match your expectations better. And so we've got a URL here that actually has a full list of these updates. And then I'm going to go ahead and just demo one of them for you. So this is a spreadsheet where it says, hey, here's the field type that you had. So if this was a date, for example, what format you were expecting, what it looked like in version 4 via the native browser API, and now what it looks like in v5. And so there are formats that didn't exist in v4 at all, because now we have greater control, we can offer more features, and there's a couple that have been removed because in general, people weren't using them. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump here over to my application, and I'm gonna let's just make a new div here. And I'm gonna say, $4.99 currency. What is this going to output? Can anyone guess? And just to help you a little bit, let's type ng version. So this is running 4.3.6. So this is the latest version of 4x. Anyone have a guess what this is going to output? USD 4.99. It's accurate. It matches the internationalization standards. But at least in the US, this does not match user expectations in terms of what a currency format should look like, right? USD 4.99, it feels very strange a little bit, at least to me as a native. So let's go ahead and at the same time as taking a look at our new pipes, let's do a full 5.0 update. So I've got a little command here I'm going to run that I'll come back to and talk a little bit more about. So I'm running a yarn command that's going to update all of my dependencies to the latest version, the @next version, excuse me. And then we're going to run ng-serve again, and we're going to see what these new dependencies and how the new pipes render out that same content. All right, we might want to come back to that. 26,000. All right, I'll come back to that in a minute. I did want to just briefly touch on just a couple things that are coming soon. Angular Material. It is not yet general availability. It still says beta. I think we're on beta 10 right now. Obviously, it's been very high quality. I've been using the material design components for more than a year. They are fantastic, but the team didn't want to put an RC label or remove the RC label or beta label until all of the APIs were finalized. And we're relatively glad they did this because one of the upcoming changes is that they're actually going through a bit of a rename. So anywhere you used to see MD, so MD button module, this is going to become MAT button module in one of the future next betas in the next few weeks. But don't worry, we've also promised that we won't finalize this and force this on anyone until we finalize automation tools that do this for you. So we had to do this across all of Google. We know what it's like to do this across thousands of lines of code and hundreds of projects. We had pretty good tooling internally that we developed to do this. And we're going to be exposing that tooling to you as well so that you can just run a executable across your application. We will use our semantic understanding of your ASTs and your TypeScript, find all the right references, fix them, and then your code will just work. So this is the promise and kind of the commitment we're making. But just keep an eye out for that in the coming releases. So this is not a huge change. It's just a rename change. It's not a feature change. You don't have to go rewrite all your code. We're just updating those references. All right. I don't know what's happening. I think I have too many things installed in global yarn here. Usually that doesn't take so long. Or maybe they cut a new release. Who knows? Another thing that's coming is a more powerful service worker. So our service worker today is really simple. You, in the Angular CLI, say service worker true, and then automatically you will get a service worker added to your production builds that looks at all the files that have been output by Webpack, and it will cache those for you. But this really only optimizes for one use case, which is offline and disconnected, where now we're caching those files and we're serving cache first. And it actually breaks a lot of user expectations about how the refresh button works, for example, right? When I hit refresh, I expect to see the latest version of my application. But with service workers, you don't see that by default. And so what we're doing is we've rebuilt our service worker to be a lot more intelligent. So one of the features we can do is we can behind the scenes update the service worker in a single tab. So when you hit refresh, we're going to give you the latest set of content right away instead of waiting for the service worker lifecycle to take advantage of that. How many people have seen this little bar pop up at the bottom of a website that says, click here to reload and refresh this page to see the latest content? Okay, it's a little annoying, right? It's not ideal to have to make the user choose to refresh your application when they just refresh the application. So we're trying to bake it into the service worker so you never have to build that feature and your users never have to experience that. We're also optimizing for additional use cases. So while previously we were optimizing for primarily offline and disconnected use cases, a lot of users end up just accessing the web via good internet connections, especially in enterprise environments where my users are always going to have a good internet connection. How can I use service workers to make their experience faster, more reliable? And so we're doing things like getting rid of this idea that we're going to recache everything on every load that are going to make this entire experience better. So you never have to see that click here to refresh button, but you're still getting the best of this is going to work offline. It's going to be faster for users because we're cache first if you want to be, and then giving you the power and flexibility to do anything else you want with a service worker. All right, I hear my fan spinning down here. So our NPM update hasn't finished. So I'm now on 5.0.0 beta 7. Let's run ng-serve and see what I've broken. So far, Deborah, you've gotten a sticker. Who else got a sticker? Called out mistakes. All right, so let's take a look. So we refresh here. Homeworks, $499. It's pretty good, right? It's not a big thing, but by taking control of these things, we're able to use formats that make more sense to developers and to users. All right, so you've basically seen the update process live. So the intent for the rest of the time was to actually help you update to the latest version, see what issues we run into. So I'm going to go through a little tutorial where we'll go through all 17 steps to update to the latest version. I'm kidding. And then I really do want to turn it back to everyone here to collaborate and do an update. I stole this idea from, I used to go to Ubuntu meetups, where they would have these major releases, and every 6 months, people would just break their computers completely by updating. So they'd have little release parties where everyone would help each other update. And I thought, hey, let's give this a try with Angular, and then we can get direct feedback about if you run into challenges, we can help fix those before the 5.0 release. So let me know if this format makes sense, if this is valuable to you, or if you don't care and this was a waste of your time. Feedback either way. So our goal here, I want to get your apps updated to the latest version of Angular, and I want to help find bugs and pain points so that we can fix them. Pretty straightforward. So step 1 of 17, update to the latest preview of Angular. So I'm going to run this npm command or yarn command, and I also have a link to this that I'll show in a second, where I basically say npm install all of the packages for Angular. The way this list is generated, or the way that I typically generate this list, is I actually usually just run ng version. And then I know that this is the list of Angular projects that I need to update. So pretty straightforward. We just did it, for example. And then I can do a production build using the latest build. So I'll do ng build-prod, and maybe I'll use our new build optimizer. And that's it. I've now updated 5. If you are still functioning, if you are still working, we've done our jobs right. If we haven't, if your code is broken, let's figure that out and work together. So what's actually happened under the hood is we've, as I said, we've done a lot of work rewriting how pipes work, rewriting how ngC works. We've removed a ton of things that were previously deprecated. And so if you look at the Angular update guide, which is a guide that we're maintaining that helps you understand all the changes that are going on under the hood, we've actually updated it now to default to 4 and 5, but you can go back to earlier versions if you want to. And you say how complex your app is, and you say, show me how to upgrade, or update, excuse me. So for example, between 2 and 4, we introduced a new thing that, hey, don't call your template tags template anymore, call them ng template. So if you hadn't done that, you'll want to go ahead and do that. If you rely on date, currency, decimal, or percent pipes, they're a little bit different. Then we have that npm command we can install. And then after the update at some point, doesn't have to be right away, you'll want to swap out your HTTP module for HTTP client module. And so the idea is this tool is really showing you all the under the hood things. So if you, for example, are a more advanced developer and you've done more customization, so you're using more of the innards of Angular, I could say I have a medium application, and we're going to expose more of the things going on under the hood. Like, for example, we got rid of opaque tokens now. You have to use an injection token. How many people here know what an opaque token is? OK. This is why we have the dropdown. And actually, so we do have a lot of very advanced developers that are using every single feature of Angular. And so if you hit advanced, you'll see every single thing that we've changed between 2 and 4, 4 and 5, and so on. Even little things like, oh, track by FN is now called track by function. Hopefully this makes sense. Again, let us know. Please, please, please give us feedback because your voice matters. The 3 values that we talk about when we talk about the way that Angular thinks, applications that users love to use, developers love to build, and a community where everyone feels welcome. Because we do this stuff and we build Angular open source so that you can be involved, so that you can know everything that's going on and have a say, and we can make Angular the best it can be. So thank you. That was the formal presentation. And now we'll actually dive into helping everyone do this. So thank you so much. And I will leave this on the screen. This also works with Yarn. If you're running Windows and don't have Bash expansion, you'll have to manually type out each @Angular before each of these. Anybody running Windows? Maybe I'll help those people first. All right. Hey.
Hoping it's going to be trivial because I don't really have Angular running on here.
OK.
Yeah, so.
No worries. OK. How's it going?
Actually, I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
For, I got the small application. I'm using
is this performance.